can write analytical geopolitical commentary in an investigative style, but I need to flag one concern before diving in. The core premise, Iran hitting a US base, destroying a command center and a destroyer, doesn't match verified events I have knowledge of, and I can't confirm it through my current knowledge. Writing a detailed, authoritative script presenting unverified military claims as real-time fact would risk spreading misinformation even in a commentary format. Let me check what's actually happening before writing anything. Good. Now I have a solid, verified picture of what's actually happening, including both sides' accounts. I can write this script with intellectual honesty, which is exactly what a credible analyst like Krainer would demand. The most compelling angle here is actually the truth about competing narratives, which is richer than either side's raw claim. Something profound is happening right now in the Gulf of Oman, and the most important question is not whether Iran hit an American destroyer. The most important question is, why are you only being offered two versions of this story, and why do both of them conveniently serve someone's agenda? Think about that for a moment. Iran's state media says its navy targeted the command and control center aboard a US Navy destroyer approaching Iranian territorial waters in the Sea of Oman on June 3, 2026. CENTCOM fires back within hours. Iran is lying. US military assets at sea continue to fly, sail, and operate safely and unimpeded. Two governments, two diametrically opposed accounts of what happened in the same stretch of water. And you, the citizen, are expected to simply pick a side and move on. That's not analysis, that's managed perception. And today we're going to go several layers deeper than that, because the real story here has nothing to do with whether a missile hit steel and everything to do with what this moment reveals about where the world is actually going. Stay with me, because there is a critical realization buried in the architecture of this conflict, something about the nature of deterrence, narrative warfare, and the slow, grinding collapse of American hegemony in the Gulf, that I'm going to fully unpack in the final third of this conversation. If you leave before we get there, you'll miss the one thing that actually explains everything you're seeing unfold. But to understand why this particular moment matters, we have to look at the broader canvas of how we arrived here, because this is not a random escalation. Nothing in geopolitics ever is. Cast your mind back to late February of this year. The United States and Iran entered what can only be described as a collision course that had been building for years, finally breaking into open conflict on February 28, 2026. What followed was extraordinary by any historical measure. Iranian forces carried out what Tehran describes as over 100 waves of retaliatory strikes against American and Israeli targets throughout the region. 16 U.S. military installations across the Middle East sustained significant damage, according to investigative findings supported by satellite imagery. An Iranian drone struck a U.S. tactical operations center in Port Shuaibah, Kuwait, on March 1st, killing 6 American soldiers, the first U.S. combat deaths of the war. And then, in what may be the single most dramatic naval event in the region in decades, the U.S. Navy submarine USS Charlotte fired 2 torpedoes at the Iranian frigate Dana in international waters near Sri Lanka on March 4th, killing 104 of its crew. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 104 Iranian sailors in international waters. That is not a skirmish. That is not a warning shot. That is an act of war by any honest definition of the term. And it is the blood of those sailors, the martyrs of the Dana, as Iranian statements now call them, that is the emotional and strategic fuel driving every Iranian military action you are watching unfold in June. When Iran's navy speaks of extracting revenge in the harshest manner, it is not rhetorical bluster. It is a government communicating to its own population, to its military, and to Washington simultaneously. It is a message written in the grammar of force. Now, Donald Trump announced a unilateral ceasefire on April 7th, and this is where the analysis becomes genuinely interesting, because a ceasefire that one side declares unilaterally, without a signed framework, without mutually agreed terms, without independent verification, is not a ceasefire in any meaningful sense. It is a pause button, and pause buttons, as any serious student of military history will tell you, are pressed when one party needs to recalibrate, not when the conflict is genuinely resolved. The deeper question, and I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, is whether Trump's ceasefire announcement on April 7th was a strategic masterstroke, a diplomatic face-saving gesture, or an admission that the military calculus had become unfavorable. Because here is what happened almost immediately after that ceasefire was declared. By April 13th, Trump announced a continuation of what he called an illegal naval blockade of Iranian vessels and ports, which Tehran viewed as a direct violation of the ceasefire's spirit, if not its letter. Iran responded by implementing far stricter controls over the Strait of Hormuz. And the Strait of Hormuz, for those who haven't spent time studying energy economics, is not simply a waterway, it is the jugular vein of the global oil market. Approximately 20% of all the world's traded oil passes through that narrow corridor. When Iran tightens its grip on the strait, it doesn't just affect US military operations, it sends tremors through Tokyo, through Berlin, through Beijing, through every economy on earth that depends on Gulf energy exports. This is the chessboard that most television analysts either fail to understand or deliberately choose not to explain. Because the game being played here is not simply military, it is economic, it is logistical, it is about who controls the arteries of global commerce in an era of shifting power. And the United States, for all its aircraft carrier strike groups and its sophisticated missile defense systems, faces a fundamental structural problem in the Gulf that no amount of firepower alone can solve. It cannot simultaneously enforce a naval blockade of Iran and keep the Strait of Hormuz open for global commerce. Those two objectives are in direct contradiction. Every day the blockade continues is a day the strait becomes a pressure cooker, and Iran holds the release valve. So when Iran's Navy on June 3rd announces that it has targeted the command and control center aboard a US destroyer approaching its waters, and CENTCOM immediately fires back calling it a lie, what you are watching is not simply a factual dispute, it is narrative warfare. Both governments are speaking simultaneously to multiple audiences. Iran is speaking to its domestic population, telling them the Navy is actively defending national sovereignty and avenging the Dana. It is speaking to regional actors, to Iraq, to Yemen's Houthis, to Hezbollah's remnants, to any actor in the region, calculating which way to lean. And it is demonstrating operational credibility, and it is speaking to Washington, testing where the red lines actually sit in a conflict that has no clearly drawn map. CENTCOM, meanwhile, is speaking to the American public, to Congress, to allied governments in Europe and the Gulf who are watching nervously, and to markets. Nothing happened. We are operating normally. The blockade continues. That statement is designed to prevent panic, prevent market disruption, maintain the appearance of uncontested naval dominance, and deny Iran the propaganda victory it seeks. Both narratives serve a function. Neither should be accepted uncritically at face value. And this brings us to something I want you to genuinely wrestle with, because it matters enormously for how you interpret everything you see and read going forward. When two governments offer directly contradictory accounts of an event in a combat zone, and when independent verification is structurally impossible, no neutral observers, no third-party naval presence, no open-source footage that definitively resolves the dispute, what you have is not a mystery waiting to be solved. What you have is a carefully managed information environment in which both parties understand that the perception of what happened is at least as strategically important as what actually happened. Welcome to the modern information battlefield. This is not a new phenomenon. It is as old as war itself. But what is new and what makes this particular conflict so geopolitically significant is the degree to which the United States is losing the information war in the global south. Because while CENTCOM is posting on X calling Iran a liar, audiences in Pakistan, in Indonesia, in Nigeria, in Brazil are consuming Iranian state media, Arab satellite channels, and social media feeds that are telling a very different story. And those audiences are not neutral. They have watched decades of American military interventions in Muslim-majority countries. They carry deep wells of accumulated grievance, and they are far more inclined to believe Tehran's account than Washington's, regardless of the underlying truth. This is a structural shift that American policymakers have not yet fully reckoned with, and it has implications far beyond the immediate conflict with Iran. Think about what happened with the IRGC strikes on the US Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain and what Iranian media describes as a regional American air base on June 3rd. Now, CENTCOM's interceptor systems reportedly engaged multiple ballistic missiles and drones. 3 missiles aimed at Bahrain were intercepted. 2 aimed at Kuwait fell short. That is the American narrative. But the very fact that Iran is able to project missile force toward the Fifth Fleet's headquarters in Bahrain, toward Kuwait, toward the Strait of Hormuz simultaneously, that operational tempo and geographic reach represents a qualitative shift in Iranian military capability that should not be dismissed simply because individual missiles were intercepted. Interception is not immunity. Every interceptor fired represents an exhaustible supply of air defense ammunition. Every successful intercept is a data point that Iran's engineers and military planners study and adapt to. This is the learning curve of modern warfare, and it operates in both directions. The United States is not the only party refining its operational picture with every exchange. Now here is where I want to bring in a dimension that almost nobody in the American media establishment is discussing with any real intellectual seriousness, and it connects directly to the broader geopolitical earthquake we are living through. The United States launched what it calls Project Freedom, a naval effort to reopen the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping, announced by Trump on a Sunday, with guided missile destroyers transiting the strait in its support. And on June 5th, Iranian media reports warning shots fired at 2 U.S. destroyers, an account that CENTCOM flatly denies, stating that Iranian forces did not attack or fire at U.S. warships and that doing so would be a gross violation of the ceasefire. Meanwhile, negotiations to end the broader conflict are described as ongoing, mediated by Pakistan, with disagreements over reopening the strait, nuclear issues, and sanctions relief all constituting major sticking points. What does that tell you about where we actually are? It tells you that both sides are simultaneously fighting and negotiating. It tells you that the ceasefire is not a ceasefire but a managed state of controlled hostility, where each side calibrates its actions to maintain pressure without crossing the threshold that would trigger full-scale escalation. It tells you that the Strait of Hormuz has become the central bargaining chip, the one lever Iran controls that can inflict maximum economic pain on the United States and its allies without requiring a single soldier to cross a border. And this is the critical realization I promised you at the beginning of this conversation, the one that reframes everything. What you are watching in the Gulf of Oman is not fundamentally a military story. It is an economic and financial story wearing military clothing. The United States is enforcing a naval blockade of Iran that it believes will squeeze Tehran into compliance on nuclear and regional security terms. Iran is countering not by trying to militarily defeat the United States Navy, an impossible task, but by making the economic cost of the blockade so high, so global, and so disruptive that the domestic and international political will to sustain it collapses before Iran's own economic endurance does. This is the asymmetric logic of the conflict in its purest form. Iran does not need to sink a U.S. destroyer. It does not need to win a naval battle. It needs to make every cargo insurer on Earth price Middle Eastern routes as existentially risky. It needs to keep oil markets jittery enough that prices stay elevated, creating fiscal pressure on Western governments already dealing with inflation fatigue and public impatience. It needs to give China, India, and other non-Western powers a continuing stake in seeing the conflict de-escalate on terms that preserve Iranian sovereignty, because those powers have their own reasons for wanting to see American unilateralism checked in the Gulf. And every missile launched, whether it hits or not, whether it is real or claimed, serves that purpose, because it feeds the uncertainty premium that markets price into every barrel of oil, every shipping contract, every insurance policy written in the region. I want to ask you something directly, and I genuinely want to read your responses in the comments, because this audience understands things that cable news panels don't. Is what we're watching in the Gulf, this strange, controlled half-war, half-negotiation, actually in any American strategic interest? When you look at the totality of it, the naval blockade that is disrupting global commerce, the U.S. air defense ammunition being expended on Iranian missiles, the American diplomatic bandwidth consumed by a conflict that has no clean military solution, the reputational cost in the global south, the opportunity cost of not being focused on China. When you add all of that up, who is this war actually serving? Because I want to be honest with you about something. The architecture of American military engagement in the Middle East has followed a remarkably consistent pattern for decades. Wars that begin with clear stated objectives, regime change, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, nuclear programs, tend to evolve into something that serves a different set of interests entirely. The defense industrial base, whose profits are measured in the manufacture of the very interceptors and missiles being consumed in real time in the Gulf, the financial interests that benefit from sustained oil price volatility, the political interests that are served by a president who can point to a foreign threat and demand domestic unity. This is not conspiracy theory. This is the documented operating logic of how American foreign policy is actually made, as distinct from how it is publicly narrated. And the Iranian leadership understands this operating logic perhaps better than any government on earth, because they have been living inside it since 1979. They know that American administrations need an Iran that is threatening enough to justify military spending and political posturing, but not so threatening that it actually destabilizes the global economy beyond recovery. That sweet spot, that carefully maintained tension is, in a dark and cynical sense, a shared interest of both governments, even as their soldiers and sailors risk their lives in the Gulf. This is what I mean when I say the real story has nothing to do with whether a missile hit a destroyer. The real story is about the architecture of power, the economy of managed conflict, and the slow, decades-long process by which American dominance in the Gulf is being contested not by military defeat but by strategic exhaustion. The United States is not going to be expelled from the Gulf at gunpoint. It is going to find, over time, that the cost of maintaining presence in the Gulf, financial, political, diplomatic, human, exceeds the benefit at precisely the moment when other theaters of strategic competition demand attention and resources. The UN World Food Programme has noted, in the context of this conflict, that millions of people are being pushed closer to the brink of hunger amid the broader Middle East conflict. Think about what that means. The geopolitical chess game being played by governments in Washington and Tehran is being paid for in the most direct and tangible way by the poorest and most vulnerable people in the region who had no vote in any of these decisions. That moral dimension tends to get lost in the tactical analysis, and it shouldn't, because the legitimacy of any government's strategic posture ultimately rests on whether the human cost it imposes can be morally justified, and that is a question that history tends to answer with brutal clarity even when contemporaries cannot. So when you watch the next CENTCOM post on X calling an Iranian claim a lie, or the next Iranian state media broadcast showing footage of a claimed strike, I want you to hold both of those things simultaneously in your mind and ask yourself the question that neither of them wants you to ask. What does this conflict look like from the perspective of someone who has no interest in either government's narrative succeeding? What does the evidence actually show? What are the structural incentives shaping each party's information environment? And what would a genuinely just and stable resolution of this crisis actually require? Because those questions, the ones that nobody on cable news is paid to ask, are the ones that actually lead somewhere real. And that ultimately is the only reason any of this analysis is worth doing. Share your thoughts below. I read every comment. And if you believe that the American public deserves a more honest accounting of what is actually happening in the Gulf right now, hit that share button, because that is the only algorithm that actually matters.